Sam Vaknin is a professor of psychology and the author of Malignant Self-Love. This is Sam Vaknin. I'm Duncan Gammy. You're listening to Dunc Tank. All right, I'm here with Sam Vaknin. Thank you very much for joining me once more.
Thank you for having me once more. Takes courage.
Well, I wanted to talk to you. This coronavirus that's jumping around has consumed the globe, and particularly in the West, you see, as you've talked about in some of your latest videos on YouTube, a lot of people retreating to their, as you say, their toilet paper fortresses, and you see people partying for spring break out on the beach when doctors are telling them to stay inside, and the hoarding of hand sanitizer. Again, not everybody, but a lot of people are being very selfish and almost have like an end of the world kind of energy to it. So what do you think is behind all that and all this this crazy response to this virus?
Well, quite a few elements. First of all, I beg to differ with the description that you used in your preamble. I don't think 35,000 dead people is the virus is consuming the world.
I just meant it's taken over our entire conversation, and I'm not saying the world's ending,
right.
Of course.
Right. Well, the world is not ending. It's actually a pretty harmless virus as far as viruses go. There has been media orchestrated panic because it's good for sales and good for eyeballs and for monetizing eyeballs. It's commercially driven. The medical profession has joined in because we are in an age where no one dares to take responsibility for anything owing to litigation and malfeasance lawsuits and you name it. Politicians have been driven by popular pressure, and because we don't have leaders as we used to, we have, nobodies, non-entities, and wannabes. And we live in a narcissistic age and society where people are enamored with themselves, they're in love with themselves, they are preoccupied with their bodies, they are extremely risk averse and hypochondriac. They dedicate inordinate amount of times to self-preservation, time for self-preservation and for avoiding risks, and so on and so forth. And there's a pretty pernicious, toxic confluence of all these very, very old and long trends. And it culminated with a virus. So the virus is a metaphor. It has a physical existence to some degree. It has infected 700,000 people in a population of 8 billion. It has killed 35,000 people. In Italy, it has killed 11,000 people, which may come as a shock to some, but this is 6 days of normal deaths in Italy. Each day in Italy, 1,800 people die of natural causes, not virus-related causes. So 11,000 people happens to be 6 days of normal deaths in Italy of natural causes. It's extremely unpleasant, lamentable, and regrettable, and if possible, could and should have been avoided. However, something like half of these deaths are of people above the age of 70 and 80. It may come as a shock to many of your narcissistic listeners, but we all have to die. We all have to die at some point, especially when we are 70 and 80. It comes with the territory. It's part of the job description of being 80. So we have to die of something. And that something happens to be right now coronavirus, which is the number 192 cause of death, mind you. So really, this has been blown way out of all proportions. The regular flu, influenza, has killed last year influenza and its complications related pneumonias, and so on and so forth, has killed last year globally 650,000 people. That's influenza alone. Influenza itself, without the complications, has killed close to 100,000 people, half of which in the United States, 40,000. That's influenza. And it's not even the number one killer. We kill people much more with sugar than we do with viruses. I mean, get a grip. This mass hysteria and mass panic, they tap into very deep and profound social trends, which I'll be happy to elaborate upon. As I said, the virus became a metaphor of our age. It's not real anymore. It's symbolic. And people are not reacting to the virus per se, because you have countries with 200 sick people. And these countries are on lockdown and quarantine, and they have 11 million citizens. This clearly is psychotic. It's a psychotic reaction. Psychosis is defined in my profession as losing touch with reality, abandoning the reality test, confusing internal objects and representations with external objects and reality. If a country has 11 million citizens and 200 of them are sick, and the other 11 million are punished for that by losing their livelihoods, this country is likely to see an epidemic of suicides and severe mental health, which will dwarf any casualties from the virus. This is insanity. End of story.
Yeah, it's a couple of things that occurred to me as you were saying that. Immediately that occurred to me was that it's something like 10,000 people, at least in the United States, die with each 1%, or it might be like 40,000 die with each 1% increase in unemployment. At the same time, I mean, the idea of the shutdown is that, you don't want to overwhelm hospitals with a huge number of cases at the same time. But it is interesting because I was just in India, and a lot of what you're talking about applies particularly to the West. Because when I was in India and the virus was this is pretty recently, like 2 weeks ago, and people were like, "Man, we've dealt with way worse than this." Like people were not freaking out that much.
Of course, you can see the reaction in third world countries such as Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. I mean, they're not faced by such a thing. I mean, it's nothing to them. Many more people die of bilharzia, which is an obscure parasite in Egypt, than have died globally from this disease. This is a Western. You're absolutely right. It's a Western phenomenon. Now, unfortunately, there are vectors of contagion which have nothing to do with the virus, via social media, via mainstream media, via Hollywood, via various representations of the virus online and offline. And of course, the panic, there's nothing more contagious than panic and hysteria and mass hysteria. Nothing. In the 19th century, there was a book called Common Delusions or Mass Delusions. I mean, this phenomenon has been described already 150 years ago. There's nothing more contagious than this. Now, if you look at the facts, I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist, I studied medicine, I have a background at observing facts dispassionately. Possibly it helps that, I'm not very strong on emotions, but I'm very strong on processing data. So if you look at data dispassionately, what you see is the following. Some countries refuse to adhere and succumb to the mass panic and mass hysteria and mass psychosis. Example is Sweden. Another example is Israel, which until very recently did not impose a quarantine. And of course, other examples are in Africa, where no country has a quarantine except South Africa. And mysteriously, in all these countries, the number of deaths is minimal. Israel has 5,000 cases and only 15 deaths. Sweden had 105 deaths. Next door neighbor, Norway, which imposed an immediate quarantine and so on, has more. I mean, there is a school in epidemiology which happens to be the orthodoxy. That's what we teach in Epidemiology 101. I'm saying we because I teach psychiatry in several universities. I teach neuroscience and so on. I'm part of the kind of medical fraternity. So my colleagues, my equivalents, the epidemiologists, they teach in Epidemiology 101. The first thing you learn, never impose a universal quarantine or universal social distancing. That's absolutely the wrong thing to do. What you do is you quarantine or isolate vulnerable populations, and you let the other non-vulnerable parts of society get infected in order to generate herd immunity. There is no other protection against a virus except herd immunity. This is not a bacterium. There's a difference between how bacteria propagate and the protections against bacteria. In the case of bacteria, you do need to impose quarantine, but not in the case of a virus, especially not a respiratory virus, and especially not a member of the SARS family. So we did everything absolutely wrong. We did everything wrong. We isolated everyone, so the people who could have resisted the virus could have served as a firewall. For example, the young were not allowed to get infected. So now there's no firewall. And what do you think will happen? The quarantine will be lifted. Social isolation at some point has to be terminated. And then we are defenseless. There will be a second wave. Even much worse. It gives time to the virus to mutate. For example, to recombine with a flu virus. And then we may face the Spanish flu. Redux.
That so I'm obviously I'm no expert in epidemiology. When we talk about herd immunity, the only thing I had heard was that the UK was thinking about doing something like that, but then some memo from their health minister got leaked out saying some crazy number of people could die, like a million people, and the idea being that young people could have the infection and not realize it, not show any symptoms, and then just pass it on to their grandparents who could die. Is that something to be concerned about?
That is true. That is true if the grandparents are allowed to be in touch with the grandchildren. I just said the vulnerable populations have to be isolated. Absolutely. Yeah. They include the old, the immunocompromised, pre-existing conditions. These people have to be, of course, isolated. And when I say isolated, I mean isolated. They shouldn't even meet the pizza delivery man. Yeah. That's what isolation means. And of course they should be isolated, no question about this. But all the others should have been exposed to the virus on purpose. There was an equivalent in another branch of medicine. For many, many decades, we have taught mothers not to expose their children to dirt. It was known as the hygiene hypothesis. And so mothers did not expose their children to dirt. Dirt, I mean soil, dirty things. Consequently, these children, generations of children, failed to develop immunity. And the long-term consequence was a dramatic quintupling of allergies, asthma, and other autoimmune disorders.
Right.
And today we instruct mothers to expose their children to dirt, to allow them to develop immunity. There is only one way to generate population-wide immunity: exposure. Nothing else works. Definitely not universal quarantine, which is strongly recommended against by any epidemiological and virological authority. Even the medical officer of the United Kingdom made very clear that it's wrong to quarantine and socially isolate the entire population. This is a political decision, not a medical one.
So
And
why
there
are
is
they
another,
making that? Yeah.
yeah,
So why are they making that decision then, do you think?
pressure via social media, panic of the population, hysteria, people misinterpreting medical statements because they are not doctors, medical doctors. No one bothers to explain things to them. Budgets, a lot of money is sloshing around mysteriously and suddenly. There's well over $300 billion for medical research. It's very tempting, enticing. So you play a bit with the truth because it gets you funding for the next 200 years. There's many dirty things going on.
The only thing that I had heard that's interesting. I didn't realize that the Britain's health official was saying that, because in the U.S., the Anthony Fauci, I think his name is, he's supposed to be like the lead infectious disease expert in the U.S., and he said something like 100,000 people might die, and I don't know if he's the one issuing these orders for quarantine or what, but do you think that that's, I mean, is that
Realistic?
or, I mean, he is an expert on these things, so I would imagine he's not just bullshitting or probably not responding
Well,
to
as I
but
said, when you mismanage the situation from the beginning, for
yeah.
example, by not immediately isolating vulnerable populations, then of course you're opening vectors of contagion that may affect and create. But it raises an ethical question. 100,000 people may die. So, how is that relevant?
Well, because that's, you don't want 100,000 people to die, right?
Most of them will be old and with pre-existing conditions. We must think of the good of the collective. You cannot destroy the economy and the future of hundreds of millions of people because someone who is 83 years old wants to live another 6 months. I am sorry.
Right.
There is a whole school of ethics in philosophy. One of my PhDs is also in philosophy. So there is a school of ethics in philosophy known as utilitarianism. And this is the most dominant school in ethics, well, nowadays. And utilitarianism states simply that always actually, you have to have an ethical calculus. The good of the collective versus the good of the individual. If, for example, we need to save one person's life by sacrificing the lives of 20, would you go for that?
Sure.
You wouldn't, wouldn't you? Well, this is precisely what we're doing.
Sorry. I thought that you had flipped it around, saying save 20 people's lives to.
No,
okay.
if you were to save one person's life by sacrificing 20,
no.
Would you? Of course not. Only an idiot would say yes. And yet, these idiots are in charge right now, it seems, because that's precisely what they're doing. I am sorry. Right. Life is tough and it ends with death. It's a fact that narcissists everywhere have to accept. They are going to die, shockingly. And when they are 80, it is expected of them to die with dignity and not to demand that the young sacrifice themselves. It is a war between the young and the old. We have reverted to the ancient world where the old used to sacrifice children to the gods to appease them.
Right.
This is the generation that left a legacy of a polluted planet, of civil wars, of 70 million displaced people and refugees. This is the legacy these 80 and 70-year-olds are leaving to their children. And now they have the audacity to demand sacrifices. The statistics are very clear. Unpleasant, but clear. only 0.5% of people under the age of 70 die of COVID-19. 0.5%. And all these people are with pre-existing conditions. The number rises above the age of 70. At the age of 70, 1.4% die. At the age of 80, 14.8% die. As it should be. Nature has to kill people who are 80. They should die. They must die. Of something, you know?
The thing is, Sam, if you went on TV and said this, people would throw rotten fruit at you. They would be so angry. Like, especially as a politician, there's no way they're going to stand up and say that.
Of course they would be angry because everyone became a narcissist. Everyone wants to live forever. Everyone is godlike. Everyone is divine and immortal. You see 90-year-olds taking care of their bodies as though they were temples and shrines, you know, fitness centers and devices that measure blood pressure and all kinds. We have become utterly immersed in ourselves to the exclusion of all else and all others. No one wants to take one for the team. Where are the people who sacrifice themselves in battlefields in World War II? People used to die for others. Now this is taboo. You can't say, listen, you are 80, you should die, because others need to develop herd immunity. Your children need to survive. No way. No way. I'm the center of the world. I'm godlike. I'm divine. I will never die. You should invest in me $100,000 in ventilators and medicines and medical stuff and I don't know what. And you know what? I'm 80-year-old or 87-year-old and I should infect a doctor who is 26-year-old. Why? How does that stand to reason? A doctor with 2 children who is 26 years old. And if you think I'm just throwing numbers, 50 doctors died in Italy. In Italy, the vast majority of the people who died were above the age of 70. Actually, more than half of the people who died were above the age of 80. 50 doctors under the age of 50 died. Is that justified? Can anyone justify this insane arithmetic?
What about the idea of saying, okay, we're gonna keep this on universal quarantine, or we're gonna keep this on quarantine, and rather than develop herd immunity, we're going to race to find a vaccine, and then once we get a vaccine,
you can't race. This is total nonsense.
Okay.
Vaccine trials, even the fastest, most expedient, would take 12 months. First of all, you need to find the vaccine, which would take anywhere between 6 and 8 months, and then another 12 months. Is the minimum for trials, even if you cut corners with clinical trials and so on. It took 3 years to develop an Ebola vaccine. It would take minimum two, probably 3 years before a vaccine will be out. Minimum 2, if we cut all possible corners. That is nonsense. There is no magic bullet coming on the way. There's no need, by the way. The pandemic is over, essentially. And not because of quarantine or social distancing. It had nothing to do with quarantine or social distancing. All these measures were utterly unnecessary, utterly destructive and unnecessary. And they were driven by narcissism, and only by narcissism. The virus is what we call a self-limiting virus. It's a family. Most viruses that belong to this family, the SARS family, they're self-limiting. That's why SARS, for example, limited itself. It didn't kill everyone. When SARS came out, they did not implement any quarantine, any social distancing, anything whatsoever. And the SARS virus, the original SARS, variant 1, was much more deadly, like hundreds of times more deadly than the current virus. And yet no one implemented any quarantine, any social isolation, any measures actually. And the virus just limited itself, died out. Actually, they don't die. What happens is that they mutate. And when they mutate, they tend to lose their potency. in the vast majority of cases. So to retain potency, they need to recombine with another virus. But SARS is an excellent example. SARS first emerged in 2002. By the way, SARS is the current virus. The current virus is a variant of SARS, known as covariant 2. So SARS first emerged in 2002. It was far more deadly than the current virus, seriously more deadly. No one panicked. There was no hysteria, no psychosis. May I also say there were no social media. Possibly there's a connection here. Doctors took over. They were in charge. Virologists, epidemiologists, immunologists, they were in charge, and they worked with a cool head. There were no measures adopted against SARS, none. So it mutated and it died away. End of story. It killed a few thousand people, of course. It mutated and it died away. It was never seen again. It died, vanished. There was an even more lethal virus, MERS, M-E-R-S, a Middle Eastern virus, first appeared in Saudi Arabia. More lethal than SARS. Killed a few hundred people. No measures were adopted. None. Not quarantine, not social distancing, nothing whatsoever. Died away. How come? These were far more dangerous viruses. I'm telling you again, there were no social media. I'm serious, completely.
Right.
The pressure, the panic didn't spread. There were no transmission mechanisms and distribution channels for panic and hysteria. Today, today there have been several developments which rendered the situation really unsustainable. First of all, today, as opposed to 20 years ago, there is profound distrust of experts, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, governments, politicians, and the mainstream media. Profound distrust. So people trust only word of mouth, crazy conspiracy theories, insane rumors. They trust these rather than trust Fauci or Donald Trump or the CNN. So there's a breakdown of trust, which did not exist 20 years ago. At that time, people still trusted. And then there is, of course, the amplification. It's an echo chamber, social media echo chambers, and everything is amplified and gets completely out of proportion. There is a narcissistic preoccupation that I mentioned with bodies. There is the intergenerational conflict. Don't forget that the current conflict between the young and the old is superimposed on previous conflicts between the young and the old. For example, the environmental movement was hijacked by teenagers. As you know, that girl from Sweden or Scandinavia,
Greta Thunberg.
Yes, she's an example, but she's not alone, by the way. She's an example. The Nobel Prize winner from Afghanistan is another example of the young taking over and defiantly and rebelliously attacking the old, attacking with justification, mind you. I'm not, they should attack.
Right.
So there was intergenerational conflict already in the wind, in the air, and the virus just helped it to the surface. So today you have, for example, in several countries in the world, you have marauding gangs of youngsters. They spit in the faces of passers-by. They spit in the faces of policemen and law enforcement. They smear all kinds of excretions, saliva and others, never mind, on surfaces. So it's like they defy curfew, they defy quarantine, they defy social distancing measures. So you have a rebellion of the young. And it's becoming more and more pronounced. In my neighborhood, they burn containers at night.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's becoming more pronounced. It's going to become, if this thing doesn't abate soon, it's going to become a global movement. And I think we're going to see open conflict. It's very reminiscent of the 1960s, the Vietnam War, or 1920s after World War I, where the young felt that they had been sacrificed by foolish British old generals, So in both those periods, there was intergenerational, open, overt conflict. And you see, there are other developments, if I may, if you want me to go into.
Yes, I was going to say, what do you think these long-term effects of the pandemic are going to be?
The pandemic itself will have zero long-term effects. It is what the pandemic brought to the surface. The pandemic didn't do anything. The pandemic was like a flashlight, a torch. It shined the light on things, trends, underlying subterranean movements, tectonic shifts that were already happening long before the pandemic. But when you become aware of something, when you become conscious of something, it acquires power and it gives you a language. So, for example, the issue of aloneness, of being alone. There was a growing trend, I call it the ascent of aloneness. There was a growing trend of atomization. There was a guy called Emil Durkheim, a sociologist, and he wrote a book about 100 years ago, if not longer, and he wrote an amazingly prescient book, amazing analysis, and he said that societies will disintegrate into their atoms, atomization, and the atoms are, of course, individuals. He said, well, such societies, called them anomic societies. In such dysfunctional anomic societies, the rate of suicide will skyrocket, and people will prefer to be alone. And we see this happening, the rise of aloneness as an ideology. People have adopted loneliness and being alone and living alone and not interacting with other people as an ideology. So you see people justifying being alone by saying, well, everyone is crazy nowadays, or it takes too much to have a relationship, or I actually enjoy my company, or I've been so abused in previous relationships that I don't dare to try again, or I am scarred, broken, damaged, and vulnerable. I prefer to nurse my wounds. There's a myriad storylines and narratives and explanations why to be alone. And starting in 2016, most people, men, especially women, but also beginning to be men, spend the entire year alone without a single meaningful human contact. And that includes family. So I think the virus will solidify and crystallize this trend to be alone, because the virus exposed the fact that we live in an age of malignant individualism. It is a technology-empowered self-sufficiency. Because you don't need anyone today. You simply don't need anyone. You can entertain yourself fully. You want movies, you get them. You want books, you have them. You name it, you have it. All you have to do is, from time to time, to exit home to the grocery store, if you live in a developing country, or to pick up the phone for them to bring, to home deliver. So this is the only human contact you must have, you can't do without, indispensable. Otherwise, you can stay in your apartment from cradle to grave, and you truly need nothing else, and nobody else. Your smartphone is all you need. And so the rise of aloneness. I think another issue that the virus brings to the surface is gender inversion or gender vertigo. Gender roles have been very fluid, with the reallocation and redistribution of power and financial and economic resources. Women became far more independent. 43% of all breadwinners in the West are women nowadays, primary breadwinners. There are many men are now stay-at-home dads, and this kind of thing. So it was in flux. Gender roles were in flux, and I think what the virus will do, it will accelerate and exacerbate this gender vertigo. I think many women will discover during this pandemic that they, one, cannot rely on men, but even more importantly, do not need to rely on men. And many men, I think, will discover in this pandemic that there are alternatives to being with a woman. In other words, I think this pandemic will kind of justify and prove that gender separation is a doable thing, that you can survive it.
Interesting.
And so there will be huge gender vertigo. Already there's a rebellion by disoriented and dislocated men, a rebellion against women, misogynistic rebellion. You have the manosphere, and within the manosphere you have MGTOWs, men going their own way, you have red pillars, you have incels, whole movements. And they number millions. I mean, we're not talking small movement.
Can you, sorry to interrupt, but for people who don't know what those things are, like men going their own way, what is that?
Men going their own way are men who had decided not to enter committed relationships with women, because they believe that women abuse and leverage these relationships to steal from them their property and livelihood and freedom.
Oh, okay.
Red pillars are simply people who believe that feminist propaganda has swept across the globe, and so people are blinded to the fact that actually women have all the power and wield it mercilessly.
Right.
So that's red pillars. And then you have incels. Incels are men who believe that women give their attentions only to successful and powerful and alpha males and winners. And therefore, 80% of the male population are unable to access sex and other sexual favors and other and intimacy with women, because women prefer only successful men. So these are examples
Right.
of intergender movement. There's a gender war going on, no question about it. But I think this virus will have proven to both genders that they do not need each other anymore. Of course, this will foster new technologies, because the minute a man is alone and a woman is alone, they still need sex. I mean, it's like breathing and eating. It's an urge. So I think there will be new technologies like holographic pornography and like seriously android-like sex dolls who will, be almost human. And I think this is the future of sex, actually. Additionally, don't forget that we don't need to procreate anymore. Procreation will be completely replaced with recreation. Already in most countries, in most industrialized countries, the birth rate is under the death rate. So there is a population decrease, year-on-year population decrease for well over 20 years already. The population of industrialized nations is decreasing, not increasing. So procreation has been replaced with recreation. And therefore, for example, committed emotional sex within relationships has been replaced with casual sex via dating apps or similar. Because casual sex has nothing to do with procreation, evidently, nor does it necessitate an investment, emotional and otherwise, resource investment in a long-term relationship. And the only reason to have a long-term relationship is to have children. And actually, the only reason to have a society is because we want to nurture future generations. We invented society for two reasons. One, to transfer wealth between generations. And two, to raise the young. To raise the young safely. These were the only reasons we invented society. It was Margaret Thatcher who said in 1987, in the modern world, we don't need a society. There's no such thing as society, she said, only individuals. Margaret Thatcher, 40 years ago.
But don't you think that in her case and in the case of society in general, the idea, as you said, to pass on wealth and raise children, but also because we're social animals and it's nice to be in social arrangements with other people, and generally speaking, your life is
no, I
for
don't think
most
so
people.
at all.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it's a myth propagated ever since the time of Aristoteles. So, zoon politikon, yes, like humans are social animals. Humans
Right.
are cooperative animals, and I think we have conflated, and confuted the two. We are team players. We are cooperative animals, but so are wolves. So we work in packs. We work in herds. And that is very useful for evolution and for survival. However, it must never be confused with social. It's nothing to do with society. Society is an organizing principle. Society is an invention, exactly like religion. It's an invention. And we have invented society simply because of the agricultural revolution, which separated the means of production, agricultural production, from the consumer, from the consumption. So consumers and producers became separate. And consumers created cities. Producers created agricultural communities. So that was the only reason. And within cities, we invented society. And we invented society within cities because cities were the least safe places in the universe for a very long time. Until, I would say, the 18th or 19th century, cities were the most dangerous places on earth because they have been besieged, pillaged, invaded, and so on. They were targets. They were targeted by nomads and barbarians and what have you. This is why we invented civilization. That's why we invented society and so on. But society relies on a premise. And the premise is there is power in numbers. There is safety in numbers. There is no self-sufficiency. Today, technology has ruined this premise, undermined it. We are self-sufficient. You can imagine yourself passing your entire life only with your smartphone for company, because your smartphone provides absolutely everything. A publishing platform, video production, audio production, you name it. News, entertainment, sex. So it's conceivable. But why are we talking in theory? It's a fact. It's a fact that the majority of people in the West since 2016 are not in touch with other people. They do not socialize anymore. That's a fact.
Yeah.
Statistical fact. So if we were truly social animals, we would have congregated despite everything. But it's a fact that people don't. And they don't because there is safety in being alone. Actually, there's been an inversion. While until the 19th century, there was safety in numbers, from the 19th century, there was safety only in being alone. If you were in Nazi Germany or in Victorian London, trust me, you would have preferred to be alone. It was, ask Charles Dickens. Ask Charles Dickens and ask any Jew in Auschwitz. It was far more dangerous to be around people than alone. So there's been an inversion. And today, we are self-sufficient and we feel better when we're alone. Any time we venture out, every time we venture out and try to reach out and try to touch another person, we get wounded, we get traumatized, we get broken, we get cheated, we get stolen from, we get,
Well, do you think though that's every time? I mean, sometimes I'll go out and I'll meet up with other people and I have a really good time.
Exactly. As long as you keep it shallow and superficial, the risk is minimal, which is precisely what people are doing. They're keeping it shallow and superficial.
I mean, not like I have friends from elementary school that we have, still deep conversations, and it doesn't feel shallow and super. I mean, I know what you're saying when you talk about there was some study, to your point, done recently about how many people do you feel like you could share like your most embarrassing secret with? And the average or the most common response from people was 0. And back in the 50s, it used to be like 5. So there has been that. Right. There has been that inversion. But I mean, do you think necessary?
No, I'm afraid the evidence is overwhelming. For example, dating among people younger than 25 has declined by 56%. That's Twenge Campbell. Dating face-to-face has declined by 56%. Among hormone-laden teenagers. So dating declined. The number of breakups, typical relationship breakups, has climbed from 2.3 in 1980 to 5.7 today. So today, typically, you would have your heart broken 6 times instead of 2.
Wow.
The number of casual sex encounters today is 6.1 for a male, for men, and 4.3 for a woman. A typical man has 6
I think you
casual
get a
sex
lot of
encounters.
women lying on those surveys.
And actually, in anonymous surveys, women admitted that the number is closer to 6. They're like men. Cheating has tripled in the past 40 years. And you imagine the trauma involved in cheating. It's an extremely destructive. Cheating has been compared to grieving the death of a parent, So it tripled. Your partner is actually almost certain to cheat on you at least once in your relationship, if your relationship is longer than 5 years. Very close to 90%. Moreover, we have a new phenomenon of serial cheaters. So it's disintegrating. All this myth, all this narrative, piece of fiction that society exists because it reflects some inner nature, that's nonsense. Exactly like the nonsense of motherhood. Motherhood is a nonsense. Sexual exclusivity is a nonsense. Not nonsense, but like an invented thing. It doesn't reflect any innate nature. These are social mores and conventions which reflected needs. We invented them because they were needed at the time, but they are no longer needed. That's precisely the issue. Technology had rendered them both obsolete and redundant. These are no longer needed. Families, communities, societies, friendships, monogamy, marriages, you know what? Shortly, even nations. Nothing is needed. None of this is needed. We've been atomized. We are floating like atoms in Salvador Dali's Galatea painting. We are floating like atoms. The virus just forced us to look in the mirror. It's the only thing it did. It forced us to look in the mirror. It killed 35,000 people, which is a drop in a drop of a drop in the ocean of deaths annually. I told you, in Italy alone, 1,800 people die daily of natural causes. Forget the virus. But the virus did force us to spend time finally alone with ourselves, to sever our relationships to other people, to witness inadequacies and shortcomings in our lifestyle and things we like in our lifestyle. Many people discovered loneliness. Go online. You'll see how right I am. Many people discovered loneliness. They say, wow, it's wonderful to be alone, So I think the virus is a catalyst. In chemical reactions, we have substances that do not participate in the chemical reaction, but speed it up. They're called catalysts. So I think the virus is a catalyst, simply, of long existing social trends, which are now going to coalesce and get amplified and become irreversible. I think the virus rendered everything irreversible. That's, of course. So there will be the world BC, before coronavirus, and there will be the world after coronavirus. And I agree with all the analysts and doomsayers and so on, that the world will never be the same. Not because the virus had done anything to anyone, to humanity. The virus had zero effect on humanity at this stage. I don't know. If it mutates, we'll see. At this stage, it had zero effect on humanity. But it had an effect on our psychology, collective social psychology, individual psychology, that is groundbreaking and irreversible.
There's so much I could dig into there, and I particularly want to zero in on people who are in isolation right now, and there are you see this at least from people my age on social media. There was this big hope that maybe coronavirus would bring people together, And then a lot of what you see is people just posting like, you know, oh, day 8 of quarantine, like I'm so bored. And I mean, do you think that this isolation is hurting people's mental health?
If I've ever heard a rhetorical question, that's the one.
Yeah, I mean, fair
Of
enough.
course,
Fair enough.
of course, it's having detrimental, deleterious, and devastating effects on people's psychology.
Yeah.
To start with, we have had prior to this extremely minor pandemic, we had a real giant pandemic. And that's a pandemic of mental health. 15% of the American population has been diagnosed with clinical depression in the year preceding the pandemic. Another 15% have been diagnosed with personality disorders, a variety of personality disorders put together. Another 15%. Another 10% have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders, other mood disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders. Well over half the American population have been diagnosed the year before the virus with severe mental health disorders. All the disorders I mentioned are considered severe, extreme. Half the population.
It's so crazy.
So, of course, if you have, for example, borderline personality disorder or an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder, let alone if you are a member of the 3% who have eating disorder or factitious disorder or body dysmorphic disorder, or of course, this pandemic, to start with, the risk, the threat to health, the threat to life, coupled with your inability to reach out, the lack of support network and social fabric to hold you. I mean, this is something that will overwhelm the defenses, the very weak defenses of numerous people. Add to this the fact that relationships, romantic and intimate relationships, have become a major engine of trauma. That today, if you interview 100 people, 50 at least, if not 80, will tell you that they have endured and experienced some trauma in a romantic or intimate relationship, and that they feel broken and damaged. Add this to the mix, and you will see the mess. There's another issue, which is not discussed, to my complete surprise. And that's the fact that immediately preceding the virus, we have reached the peak of income inequality in human history. It exceeded the 1920s Gilded Age for the first time. That was, to the best of our knowledge and to the best of the work of Piketty and others, the height of income inequality in human history. It simply means that a minuscule number of people, 10,000, held as much wealth as half of humanity. And 100 people, 100 richest people in the Northern Hemisphere held as much wealth and resources as all the blacks in the United States, all the Hispanics in the United States, and 15 million whites in the United States combined. That's 100 people. So income inequality became insane. Now, the effect of this virus will be to increase income inequality to unimaginable levels. Why? Because if you are self-employed, you're doomed, you're finished. Because if you run a small business, you and your workers are doomed and finished. This virus will destroy completely entrepreneurs, small businesses, medium businesses, and the self-employed. They're gone, they're history, they're a fluke. They will become a footnote in economic dictionaries. The only ones who will survive this mess are big businesses. Only ones. And they will swallow up and digest small businesses and medium businesses, of course. And they will employ the people who are currently made redundant. These people will find employment, but in big businesses. There will be a major, unprecedented consolidation of economic power. And because big businesses are overwhelmingly owned by these 100 people that I mentioned, it will constitute a transfer of wealth from the poor the self-employed, the small businesses and the medium businesses, to the ultra-rich, super-rich, a transfer of wealth, the likes of which has never been seen or imagined in the annals of humanity. Now, once this happens, it will create a society of slaves and masters. You see, it's not possible to maintain political equality in an environment of such extreme wealth inequality. Not possible. It's a myth, another piece of unmitigated trash and nonsense. You can't have a democracy with income inequality. You can't, simply can't. What you do have is a plutocracy. The plutocracy, the rule of the rich, may masquerade as democracy, but it has nothing to do with democracy. The levels of power are where the levels of money are. And even in the current climate of income inequality, it has been very difficult to maintain democracy. Almost impossible. And in a huge number of countries, democracy has vanished altogether. Turkey, Russia, Hungary. If income inequality will quintuple, which I think is what's going to happen more or less, you can forget about democracy. You can forget about political institutions. There will be direct rule by the rich. And so we will revert to the latter days of the Roman Empire. We will revert to the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. We'll revert to the ancient world. We'll revert to a situation where we'll have masters and slaves in all but name, the likes of which even Marx did not imagine. Even Marxism did not imagine this condition. Because in Victorian London, where Marx wrote Das Kapital, the workers still, for example, were able to unionize. It is a fact that Marxism and communism were created there. It was a rebellion of the workers. Unionization became, unions became very strong after that. And in America, after the Haymarket riot, unions became strong. Hoffa, yes?
Right.
But today, the workers have no leverage, nothing. They cannot unionize. The Supreme Court is against them. The judicial system, law enforcement will be used against them. Masters of the universe will render them utter slaves, like in ancient Greece. Not even in Rome, because in Rome slaves had rights and they could free themselves. Like in ancient Greece or in Egypt.
I want to ask you, for people who are isolated right now, and you've written and spoken so much about narcissists, what about for people who are in isolation with a narcissist? You compared this to almost like a hostage situation. How do you think people should navigate that?
As they would in a hostage situation. When you're with a kidnapper, violent kidnapper, potentially violent kidnapper, definitely an aggressive kidnapper, the only effective method is what I call background noise. There are many effective techniques. I've just given a lecture in Hungary about this. There are many effective techniques, 8 actually, effective techniques to cope with narcissists. 7 of which I invented and 1 I did not invent, unfortunately. And that one that I did not invent happens to be the second most effective. It's known as gray rock. So these techniques cannot be used in the current situation because they will tend to provoke and aggravate the narcissism and render the narcissist aggressive and potentially violent. So you should not use any of these techniques. You can't do no contact, of course. And you should not do gray rock, or you should not do mirroring to mirror the narcissist's behavior. None of these techniques should be used right now because you're in close proximity and you are a hostage. You can't leave. So the only effective technique that I know of is background noise. Background noise simply means that you are reactive, never proactive. So if a narcissist asks you something, you answer, but you limit your answer to the exact content of the question. You don't initiate, you don't expand, you never ever offer advice or help. because that's perceived as narcissistic injury, implying that the narcissist is not godlike, is not omnipotent, is in need of help or advice. Yes? You never argue, you never disagree, you never criticize, you never bring information from the outside because the narcissist is the only source of wisdom and knowledge. You are inert, an inert object which responds to the narcissist's queries, questions, and demands, but respond in a point-like, you should respond in a point-like manner. Limit yourself to the narcissist's prompts. Do not demonstrate any independent or autonomous existence. Do not mention the outside world to the narcissist, because in a pandemic, the narcissist feels helpless. It contradicts, directly challenges his omnipotent grandiosity. If he is a god, why is he being socially isolated and distanced? So they should never mention to the narcissist the outside environment and how it limits him, how it equalizes him, because a pandemic is a great equalizer. Everyone is equal before the law in theory, never works, but everyone is definitely equal before a pandemic, always works. And the narcissist hates to be equalized. He hates to be considered common, average, one of a herd. If narcissists cannot consider the concept of herd immunity. Right. So this would be basically my advice.
I see. And we're a little past an hour here. So sure. I know you don't have all the time in the world. So the last question I wanted to ask you is, as we look ahead with this virus, even if we cannot influence what our politicians are doing, what sorts of advice would you give to folks listening?
Barring a mutation, and that's a big if. It's a big if, because viruses tend to mutate. Luckily, the SARS family mutates very slowly. That's our huge luck. But the fear is not the mutation, but recombinant with another virus. But anyhow, barring this, which admittedly is an unlikely scenario, but barring this, I think the pandemic is winding down. It's winding down even in heavily affected areas such as Italy, United States, United Kingdom, and Spain. It's going to take another 2-3 weeks, and the virus will be behind us largely. But then we will have to cope with the effects of our measures, which will far exceed anything the virus had ever done, on mental health, on economic livelihood, on rents, where to live. I think many people will be forced to reunite with their families of origin, which is a source of enormous tension, going back to mommy, going back to daddy. Education will be severely disrupted. So we're going to live in a very disrupted and disruptive environment where certainty is not afforded. We cannot predict anything, and we are not in control. In other words, it's an environment of helplessness. What we should resist with all our forces is helplessness. We should not succumb to learned helplessness. We should initiate things. We should plan ahead, even if these plans evidently will never come true. We should maintain control. We should be fixated on control, controlling our destinies, controlling our health, controlling our families. We should reassert mastery. We should become assertive, not defiant, not aggressive, but definitely assertive. We should not let circumstances play with us, but we should try to grab hold of the horns, the dilemma of existence. And to the best of our ability, many of us, unfortunately, are broken and damaged, mentally ill, or sick, physically and otherwise. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy also because in the industrialized West and in countries such as Japan, a huge chunk of the population is old, simply. 23% of the population of Italy is above the age of 65, which would explain why so many people die there. The same number in Japan. We have many old people around, and now the young have been wounded and paralyzed and obstructed by the pandemic, and the young would need first and above everything else to take care of themselves and of the future for all of us. It's a multitasking effort, and I sure hope that people will be able to cope with this particular multitasking, because they do it well on a smartphone. In reality, it tends to be a lot more multidimensional and throw many more curveballs. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Yeah. Well, Sam, thank you very much for your time. This was a highly entertaining talk, and stay safe.
Thank you, Duncan. You too. Stay healthy.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you to Sam Vaknin, and thank you for listening to Dunc Tank. I'm Duncan Gammy. I'll see you next time.